It's still dark in Kansas City. The streets are quiet, broken only by the scrape of wagon wheels on frost. A skinny boy pushes a heavy sack of newspapers, the ink staining his fingers. His breath clouds in the air as he trudges door to door. The work is relentless. Every morning before school, every evening after dinner. No holidays, no excuses, his father insists. But every so often between houses, the boy steals a moment. He pulls a stub of pencil from his pocket and scratches a quick sketch on the margin of a newspaper. A mouse, a train, a castle, shapes and stories no one else can see yet. That boy was Walt Disney. And in those quiet stolen moments, a seed was planted. One that would grow into worlds far larger than even he could imagine. Most people know Disney as an empire today, a global brand stamped on everything from theme parks to streaming platforms. But long before the fireworks, the castles, the mouse ears, Walt's life was marked by struggle, setbacks, and an almost stubborn refusal to stop dreaming. The road to greatness didn't begin with triumph. It began with a boy sketching in black and white, clinging to an imagination that gave him hope when everything else seemed gray. That's where our trilogy begins. Welcome to The Path to Greatness, a special series within the Strategic Thinker. Here, we step inside the extraordinary journeys of icons and brands to study the choices, the struggles, and the strategies that shape their legacies. This series is a little different from our regular episodes. Instead of frameworks first, we begin with story. Greatness in any field isn't built from theory alone. It's lived and compounded by decisions along the way. Over these 3 chapters, we'll follow Walt Disney's path from the boy sketching in black and white to the architect who risked everything for Snow White to the visionary who built a kingdom that still shapes culture today. The goal isn't to copy Walt's journey. It's unlikely to work too well. Everybody's journey has its nuances. What works for me might not work for you. What worked for Walt might not work for us. That said, is to see what Walt's journey teaches us about resilience, imagination, systems, and legacy, and to ask how we might apply these lessons in our own paths to greatness. So wherever you are on your path, whether you are leading a team, starting something new, or searching for your next step, this trilogy is designed to give you perspective, courage, and tools to keep moving forward. In this first chapter, we will trace Walt's early journey from the sparks of childhood curiosity through the sting of failure and finally to the moment he created a mouse that would change the world. Along the different points of the story, we'll pause to ask what Walt's story means for us. Because his life wasn't only about cartoons or theme parks. It was about resilience, vision, and learning to turn setbacks into stepping stones. So before we continue, here's the question for today. What might happen if we treated our earliest sparks of imagination not as childish whims, but as compasses pointing us forward? When you think back to your own childhood, what spark still lingers, even if you've ignored it for years? This is The Dreamer in black and white. Let's dive in. The year is 1909. The streets of Kansas City are quiet at dawn, except for the sound of wagon wheels crunching against frost. In the half-light, a boy struggles under the weight of a heavy sack of newspapers. His fingers are numb, ink already smudged into his skin. This is Walt Disney at about 9 years old. His father, Elias, is stern and uncompromising. He believes children should work hard and waste nothing. The paper route isn't a chore, it's a duty. Every morning before school, every evening after dinner, in rain, heat, or snow, Walt trudges door to door, delivering the news. It is exhausting work. No holidays, no excuses. But yet, even then, Walt finds ways to steal time. Between houses, he pulls out a stub or pencil and scribbles in the margins of newspapers. A dog with a grin, a train with eyes, a mouse standing taller than he should. His sketches are rough, fast, and unfinished. But for Walt, they are treasures. Proof that imagination can slip through the cracks even when life feels grey. Growing up in the Disney household meant structure, chores, and a father who rarely offered praise. For a child like Walt, drawing became more than a pastime. It was an escape, a sanctuary. Every night he drew gave him a sense, every night he drew gave him a sense of control, a chance to invent something new when the world around him felt dictated by someone else's rules. The family moved often in those years, chasing stability Elias never quite found. Walt carried his pencils and scraps with him each time. He was never without them. Even then, he seemed to understand something. When you can't control your circumstances, you can still control the worlds you imagine. That discipline, to dream even when the world is heavy, will stay with him for life. When life feels constrained, what practice helps you breathe and dream again? Imagination doesn't live in isolation. Walt's sketches were constantly fed by what he saw in the world around him. At school, he was drawn to comic strips, simple panels filled with exaggerated expressions and visual jokes. At the movies, he devoured silent films, watched how actors use movement and timing to communicate without words. And whenever he could, he would sneak off to see vaudeville acts, fascinated by their humor and rhythm. Each of these left an imprint. He would return home, sit at the kitchen table or in the barn, and sketch what he remembered. Not just copying, but experimenting. What if the comic character kept running after the last panel? What if a silent film gag could be drawn instead of acted? Without realizing it, Walt was rehearsing for the craft that would later define his career, the art of bringing drawings to life through movement and story. Curiosity compounds once it's sparked. One influence sparks another until the connections you didn't see at first become obvious. It didn't take long for Walt's drawings to move beyond his own notebooks. Neighbors began to notice sketches. Some asked him to draw their farm animals or to create simple caricatures. A few even offered pennies in exchange. Imagine what that felt like to a boy, to discover that the worlds in his head could not only entertain him but matter to others, that they had value. There's a story of Walt painting animals on the side of his father's barn. It was crude, childlike, but it turned the barn into a kind of gallery. Neighbors would stop to look. Some smiled, some chuckled, some shook their heads. But they noticed. For Walt, that was everything. It was the first taste of what it meant to share imagination with the world, and it carried a risk. Because once you share, you invite judgment. But Walt learned early that the joy of sharing outweighed the fear of criticism. That willingness to put his imagination on display, however rough, however incomplete, became the pattern he would repeat for decades. Where might you be keeping your ideas private when the real growth will only come after you let others see them? Of course, not everyone saw value in Walt's sketches. His father, Elias, dismissed them. To Elias, drawing was idle, a distraction from real work. That created a tension that defined Walt's early years. By day, he delivered papers, tended chores, and followed his father's strict expectations. By night, he filled his notebooks with characters no one else believed in. He was living in two worlds, one defined by duty, the other by imagination. Many of us face this same conflict in different forms. The world around us demands one path: stability, predictability, the safe choice. But inside, another voice whispers, there's something more. For Walt, the voice of imagination always won, quietly, persistently. It was an open rebellion. He didn't refuse the paper routes or chores, but he carved out space, however small, to keep the dream alive. That persistence would later become the foundation of his resilience. So, before Mickey, before Snow White, before all the castles and fireworks, Walt Disney was simply a boy with ink-stained fingers, sketching cartoons in the margins of newspapers. A boy who lived in a black and white world but dreamed in color. Those early sparks mattered. They taught him that imagination could be sanctuary, that curiosity compounds, and that sharing, even at the risk of judgment, is what brings ideas to life. But sparks alone don't guarantee success. Soon, Walt's sketches would collide with reality. Rent had to be paid. Businesses had to survive. And in the harsh light of the real world, imagination alone would not be enough. That's the story we turn to next. The young man who launched his first studio tasted failure and learned the painful tuition that every dreamer eventually pays. The boy with the pencil grows up. The sketches that once hid in the margins now demand a bigger canvas. Walt is a teenager when he discovers something that changes everything. Animation isn't just drawings. It's movement, timing, rhythm. It's the illusion of life. He studies frame by frame how a character can trip, fall, and get back up, and how that little journey, fall, pause, rise, can make an audience feel something. He sees the heartbeat inside the gag. He takes odd jobs to stay close to art, posters, ads, little assignments that teach him deadlines and clients and what it meant to deliver under pressure. It isn't glamorous, but it's a bridge from hobby to craft. And then, ambition whispers a bigger question. What if I tried this on my own? The first studio isn't really a studio. It's a room over a garage with a borrowed camera and a budget that amounts to lunch money. The equipment was temperamental, to say the least. The lights run hot. The table shakes if a car passes outside. But none of that matters when you are young and certain that the world is about to discover you. He calls friends to help. They work late. They improvise rigs out of scrap wood and string. They ink by hand and shoot by trial and error. The footage flickers. The edges don't always line up. But there's a spark in the work. Something playful, something fresh. What they lack in polish, they certainly make up for in momentum. Walt learns fast that animation isn't just art. It's about logistics. A reel has to be finished, a client has to pay, rent is due. Whether inspiration shows up or not, he builds schedules on paper, then breaks them in reality, then builds them up again. He discovers that optimism is a poor substitute for cash flow. Still, there's progress. A few shorts get made. A few small checks arrive. He can almost hear the future knocking. Where in your life are you waiting for perfect conditions? When momentum will come faster if you started with what you have. This tiny room over the garage becomes too small for his ideas. He opens a real studio. Bare floors, a few desks, and a handful of young artists who believe in him enough to work for little more than hope. They call it Laugh-O-Gram. It's a good name. It sounds like mischief delivered to your door. The team experiments with modern spins on familiar stories, fairy tales told with a wink. The shorts are clever and charming. They earn smiles in theaters that play them. The artists learn quickly, feeding off each other's energy. A style begins to emerge, not just slapstick, but heart. But behind the laughter, the finances wobble. The distribution deals thin, payments arriving late, and then later, then not at all. Costs creep, payroll looms. Walt learns the difference between making something people love and building a business that can survive. He sells his car to cover salaries. He convinces the landlord to wait just one more week. He promises the team that the next contract will fix everything. He believes it when he says it too. And then the letters come, overdue, past due, final notice. The artists keep drawing. Walt keeps smiling. But the numbers insist on the truth. One night, he locks the door to the studio and sits alone at the desk, covered in pencil shavings. The room smells of ink and coffee and the ghost of jokes that used to fill the air. He stares at a stack of unpaid bills. He presses his palms against them, as if pressure could turn paper into money. It can't. The company folds. He walks out with a box of drawings, a camera he can no longer afford to keep, and a lesson that feels like a bruise. Talent can open a door. Cash flow keeps it from closing. What lesson did a recent setback try to teach you? And have you actually absorbed it? Or are you repeating the same pattern? Now, here's the thing about a failure that hurts. If you treat it like a verdict, it ends you. Treat it like tuition and it trains you. Walt chooses tuition, of course. He catalogs what went wrong, deals that look friendly but weren't binding, budgets that hoped for the best instead of planning the worst, a studio built on late payments and borrowed time. He realizes that craft and cash must walk hand in hand, or one will drag the other to the ground. He doesn't give up on animation. He gives up on the illusion that art alone will save the business. There is a stubbornness in him. Quite a useful kind. He decides to build again, but this time, smarter, leaner, with terms that protect the work, not just flatter the dream. Still, he needs a bridge from here to there. He needs a way to show the world he's more than a shuttered studio. So he makes something different. A short film that blends live action with animation. A little girl stepping into a drawn world. It's a proof of concept, a calling card, a promise in motion. When he screens it for friends, the room tilts forward. People lean in. The idea isn't just novel. It feels like a door opening to somewhere new. But doors like that rarely open in the same city where you first knock. There are moments in a life when the map is simple. Stay or go. Walt looks at the familiar streets that held both his beginnings and his bankruptcy. He thinks about the friends he can no longer afford to employ. He thinks about the bills he can't pay and the dreams he still can't put down. He sells what he can. He packs what he must. He buys a one-way ticket west. The legend says he had a few dollars in his pocket and a suitcase in his hand. The exact number of dollars doesn't matter. What matters is that he carried two things that weighed far more: a reel of film that proved an idea, and a refusal to let the last failure be the last word. On the train, he pulls out a notebook and writes lists. What to do first, who to call, and where to pitch. He sketches shots and scenes in the margins, the way he did as a boy between houses on the paper route. Different train, same habit, the rhythm of forward motion. Outside the window, the country unspools in strips of field and sky. Inside the car, a young man sharpens a plan. If you framed your last failure as tuition, what would you build differently on the next attempt? Living isn't just geography, it's identity. It's admitting that the first version of the dream didn't work, and deciding you'll write a second draft anyway. Walt says quiet goodbyes to the artist who took a chance on him, to the landlord who waited longer than he should have, to the streets that taught him how to work when the sun wasn't up yet. He doesn't burn bridges. He leaves doors ajar, promising to send word when the next thing takes shape. That choice matters. Closing doors feels decisive. Keeping relationships alive builds the network you will need later. Walt understands this instinctively. Move forward, but don't scorch the earth behind you. That mindset will echo through his entire career. If you could open Walt's suitcase on that train, you'll find more than a change of clothes and a film reel. You'll find a portable curriculum. Discipline from those dawn paper routes. Craft from thousands of sketches turned into moving frames. Courage from sharing work before it was perfect. Clarity about the business mechanics that must support art. Conviction that innovation, like mixing live action and animation, can pry open new doors. He isn't starting from zero. He's starting from experience, and that's a different starting line altogether. Before the West Coast gamble truly begins, there's a thread worth pulling: partnership. In the early days, Walt drew alongside friends who were better than he was at certain things: cleaner lines, smoother motion, steadier hands. Instead of feeling threatened, he felt galvanized. He wanted to build a room where the best idea won, where the craft lifted because the standard did. That instinct to find and keep great partners will shape everything. The biggest dreams require more than one pair of hands, more than one mind at the table. Walt's genius won't be solitary. It will be amplified by the people he trusts. And the sting of failure has already taught him what to protect when those partnerships meet the real world: rights, credit, ownership. He hasn't learned all the lessons yet. Some will arrive painfully later, which we'll cover. But the outline is there. Night falls. The cabin lights flicker. The country quiets. Walt closes his notebook and rests his head against the glass. The train rocks with a kind of certainty that feels like a promise. Forward, forward, forward. By morning, a new city will ask a young animator a hard question. What do you have to show me? He has an answer now. Not just sketches, not just charm. He has a film that proves he can imagine a bridge between worlds and a resolve tempered by everything it cost to get here. The first studio failed, the dream didn't. That instinct is the hinge the rest of his life will swing on. Before the Marvels that would become household names, there was a room over a garage, a studio called Laugh-O-Gram, a stack of unpaid bills, and a decision to try again. This is the part of the story that most people gloss over. The grind, the miscalculations, the rent that didn't care about your talent. But this is where greatness takes shape, in the gap between what you wanted to happen and what actually did, and the choice you make after. Next, the story shifts west. New allies, new contracts, new risks, and a lesson about ownership that will cut deep enough to leave a permanent mark. Before we continue with how Walt clawed his way back from failure and create Mickey Mouse, let me pause for a moment. You are listening to Path to Greatness, Path of the Strategic Thinker. If Walt's early struggles are resonating with you, make sure you are following the show so you won't miss the rest of this trilogy. And if you'd like to go deeper, join us at maisontsc.com or connect with us on socials. That's where I share extra frameworks and behind-the-scenes notes to help you apply these lessons in your own path to greatness. All right, back to the story. The train slowed as it rolled into Los Angeles in the summer of 1923. The air smelled different here, dry, citrus sweet, a little dusty. Walt Disney stepped onto the platform with a suitcase, a film reel under his arm, and less than $50 in his pocket. He was 21, broke from the collapse of Laugh-O-Gram studio, but definitely not broken. Los Angeles wasn't the polished movie capital it would later become. The hills still carried orchards. The streets mixed horse-drawn wagons with cars that rattled like tin cans. But one thing was clear. This was where the future of film was being built, and Walt wanted in. The first place he went wasn't a studio but a sick room. His older brother, Roy, was recovering from illness at a veterans hospital. Roy had always been the practical one, steady, cautious, a counterweight to Walt's restless ambition. Lying in that hospital bed, Roy might have been forgiven for telling his younger brother to grow up and get a steady job, but Roy saw something in Walt's conviction. Against the odds, he agreed to join forces. And so, the Disney Brothers studio was born. Their office was no bigger than a modern living room, crammed into the back of a real estate building. One desk, a camera balanced on a shaky hand. Sheets of paper pinned to the walls. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Together, they began producing a series based on Walt's latest experiment, a short where a real girl stepped into a cartoon world. He called it Alice's Wonderland. The Alice comedies were scrappy, inventive, and different. Walt convinced a young actress, Virginia Davis, to star, then painstakingly combined live footage with his drawings. The first reels were rough, the lines jittered, the timing was uneven, but the concept was fresh. A child interacting with animated cats and dogs, audiences leaned forward. It was magic, stitched together with tape and persistence. Walt shipped the reel east, hoping someone would bite, and someone did. Margaret Winkler, one of the few female distributors in a male-dominated industry, agreed to release a series. The Disney Brothers studio suddenly had contracts, deadlines, and a reason to hire more artists. The office filled with scratching pencils, the clatter of the camera, the smell of coffee gone cold. Paychecks were small, hours were long, but spirits were high. For the first time, Walt felt momentum that didn't collapse under him. He had crossed the country with almost nothing, and now reels carrying his name were arriving in theaters. So, who balances you the way Roy balanced Walt? Someone whose strength fills the gap in yours. And how might you build more intentionally with them? The Alice comedies carried the studio for several years, but by 1927, audiences were growing restless. Walt knew he needed something new, something faster, funnier, built to the headline instead of support. That's when Oswald appeared. Oswald, the lucky rabbit, had big ears, rubber-hose limbs, and a mischievous grin. He wasn't elegant, but he was memorable. More importantly, he moved with a bounce that audiences loved. Oswald was a hit. Theater owners ordered more shorts. Contracts rolled in. The Disney Brothers studio expanded again, hiring additional animators. Walt felt at last that he had built a foundation that could last. He began to imagine Oswald on toys, watches, posters, maybe even feature-length adventures one day. But the foundation wasn't his. So when Margaret Winkler stepped back from business, her husband Charles Mintz took over distribution. Mintz handled contracts with Universal Pictures, which quietly kept the rights to Oswald. Walt focused on creating, missed the fine print. He assumed Oswald belonged to the studio that had created him. But legally, Oswald was Universal's property. It was a blind spot, one born of optimism, trust, and inexperience. So, in 1928, that blind spot snapped shut. Walt boarded a train for New York, confident he was there to renegotiate his contract, certain that Oswald's success deserved higher pay and more security. Instead, Mintz delivered a hammer blow. Universal owned Oswald. The contracts had already been signed. What's more, most of Walt's animators had agreed to leave him for Mintz's new studio. It was betrayal in black ink. Walt argued, he pleaded, but the message was clear. Without Oswald, without his team, he had nothing. He left the meeting shaken. On the train back to California, the optimism that had carried him west 5 years earlier evaporated. He stared out of the window as the countryside blurred past, replaying every decision that led him there. The studio wasn't his, the character wasn't his, the people weren't his. He was 26, and once again, almost empty-handed. It's easy to read this now, knowing what comes next and seeing it as a turning point. But in that moment, it felt like collapse. Still, the collapse left lessons carved in scar tissue. Ownership matters. Never again would Walt hand over rights without a fight. Culture matters. Loyalty couldn't be taken for granted. Team had to be nurtured, not assumed. Resilience matters. If imagination was his compass, betrayal would not be the storm that sank him. These weren't abstract principles. They were wounds he would carry forward, sharper than any classroom lesson. The train rattled westward. Walt filled pages of his sketchbook trying to draw the sting out of his system. Rabbits, rabbits, more rabbits, until he couldn't stand the sight of them anymore. His future looked as blank as the pages still left. The Disney Brothers studio was in danger. Roy worried about the finances. Staff morale dropped with the news. For the second time in a decade, Walt stood at the edge of losing everything. He could have given up. Many would have. But there, in the space between betrayal and despair, a spark returned to his pencil. A sketch, not of a rabbit, but of something smaller, rounder, curious. A mouse. The betrayal of Walt left Walt stripped of his animators, his contracts, and his most popular character. It was by every measure a devastating defeat. And yet, in that low moment, the habit that had carried him since childhood remained. When the world closed in, he picked up a pencil. That pencil would soon give birth to a character who whistled, danced, and carried Disney out of the shadows. But in this act, the mouse is still just a doodle, a flicker of resilience. The real redemption comes next. The train carried Walt westward, its steel wheels clattering like a clock he couldn't stop. Each turn on the track brought him closer to California, but further from certainty. In his sketchbook, rabbits crowded the pages. Oswald's in different poses reminded of what he had lost. He drew them until his pencil slowed, then stopped. The rabbit no longer belonged to him. He turned the page. What appeared next wasn't deliberate. A small creature, rounder, simpler, big ears. A playful grin. Something with the resilience of a street urchin and the charm of a trickster. A mouse. Walt smiled despite himself. At first, he called him Mortimer. His wife Lillian frowned. Too pompous, she said. He looks like a Mickey. That name landed like a spark on dry wood. That spark would ignite the rest of Walt's life. Walt later told this story often. But whether it was exactly on that train or just after, what I'm pretty certain of is that the mouse was born in that season of loss. Back in Los Angeles, Walt returned to the studio with Mickey in hand. The team was smaller now, those who hadn't defected to Universal. But they shared a kind of scrappy loyalty, the belief that maybe, just maybe, this mouse could carry them through. The first Mickey shorts were lighthearted, filled with gags and bounce. Playing crazy, galloping gaucho. They were clever, but not yet magic. Theater owners showed polite interest but no rush. Walt knew they needed more. The mouse wasn't enough on his own. He needed a leap. Something that would make audiences not just smile, but gasp. That's when he heard about synchronized sound. Movies were just beginning to talk. The Jazz Singer had premiered in 1927, shocking audiences with voices synced to moving lips. For Walt, the idea was irresistible. What if cartoons didn't just move? What if they sang, squeaked, and laughed in rhythm with music? The problem, no one had done it successfully. Synchronization required precision the industry didn't yet have. It demanded new equipment, tighter timing, money the studio could barely scrape together. Roy balked. The finances were already tight. Was this really the time to gamble? But Walt insisted. He saw it not as a gamble, but as necessity. Without innovation, Mickey would vanish like every other short. With sound, he could leap off the screen and into hearts. The team worked relentlessly, experimenting with timing, soundtracks, and sound effects. Walt himself provided Mickey's squeaks and whistles. They recorded, adjusted, re-recorded, fighting to line every frame with every beat. It was chaos disguised as creation, but beneath it reigned conviction. November 18, 1928, New York City, the Colony Theater. The audience filled in, expecting a simple cartoon. The lights dimmed, the projector hummed, and suddenly, Mickey appeared at the wheel of a steamboat, whistling in perfect rhythm. Gasps filled the theater, then laughter, then applause. Every gag landed harder because of sound. A goat swallowed a sheet of music, and Mickey pulled his tail like an accordion. A parrot squawked, and Mickey snapped back in tune. The rhythm carried the cartoon beyond drawings. It became a performance. When the short ended, the theater erupted. Overnight, Mickey Mouse became a phenomenon. From the ashes of betrayal rose the most enduring character of the 20th century. Walt had lost Oswald, but in that loss, he found Mickey. We found Mickey. More importantly, he learned a lesson that would guide him for life. Loss is not the end. It's the beginning of reinvention. Innovation multiplies imagination. Mickey was charming, but synchronized sound made him unforgettable. Resilience is a choice. Betrayal could have been a tombstone. Instead, it became a new foundation. These lessons were written in survival. When something important is taken from you, what act of reinvention could help you write a new beginning? Mickey wasn't just a cartoon, he was an asset. Walt and Roy quickly secured merchandising deals. Mickey Mouse watches, toys, comic strips. Each product carried the mouse beyond the theater into homes and hands. For Walt, this was more than income. It was proof that imagination, protected by ownership and multiplied through innovation, could grow into something durable. He poured the profits back into the studio, hiring more animators, training them, building systems that would support the next leap. But the scars of Oswald lingered. Walt insisted on contracts that kept rights in-house. Mickey would always remain Disney's. For the first time, Walt could excel. The boy who once sketched in the margins of newspapers, the bankrupt young animator in Kansas City, the betrayed creator on a New York train. Now he had a character, a studio, and momentum that truly belonged to him. It didn't erase the failures. It built on them. Failure had been tuition. Mickey was the dividend. And with that, Walt Disney finally had his first real foundation. Not just for survival, but for a future no one else could yet see. As we close this first chapter of Walt Disney's journey, let's pause and draw out the lessons that echoed beyond the story. Because the point of Path to Greatness isn't just to admire an icon, it's to hold up a mirror and ask what we can learn for our own lives. Imagination as compass. Walt's path began in the margins of a newspaper, with doodles sketched between paper deliveries. For him, imagination wasn't a luxury, it was a compass. It pointed towards possibility when the world around him felt gray, strict, and limited. That compass guided every step, from the barn walls he painted, to the Alice shorts, to the train ride where Mickey was born. And here's the reminder for us. You don't need certainty about the whole path. You just need to honor the spark that points forward. What spark in your life could serve as a compass, even if you don't yet know the whole map? Failure as tuition. Walt's first studio Laugh-O-Gram collapsed under the weight of late payments and thin margins. For most, that would have been the end. For Walt, it was tuition. The lessons were brutal, but invaluable. Talent isn't enough, optimism doesn't pay rent, and cash flow keeps the doors open. Instead of treating failure as a verdict, he treated it as a classroom. What failure in your past might have been tuition? And what is it trying to teach you even now? Ownership as leverage. The Oswald betrayal cut deep. Walt had created a character audiences loved, only to discover the rights weren't his. Contracts had been signed, his team had been poached. It was devastating, but it also etched principle into Walt's DNA. That ownership is leverage. Without it, you build castles on sand. With it, you have a foundation that can withstand storms. This lesson shaped everything that followed, from Mickey's protection to the way Disney built systems that kept control of their creations. Where in your own work might you be creating value without securing ownership of it? Innovation as a multiplier. Mickey alone was charming, but Mickey with synchronized sound was revolutionary. Steamboat Willie didn't just introduce a character, it introduced an experience audiences had never seen before. That's the pattern. Imagination gives direction. Innovation multiplies impact. For Walt, innovation wasn't optional. It was the difference between obscurity and resonance. So where could a bold innovation multiply the reach of your current ideas? Resilience as a choice. Threaded through every stage is one more theme: resilience. Walt had reason to quit more than once. After Lavogram, after Oswald, after betrayal. Each time, he chose to persist. Resilience wasn't automatic, it was a decision, made in a quiet moment after defeat. It was a boy pulling out a pencil when his father dismissed him. A bankrupt young man sketching when creditors knocked. An animator betrayed on paper who still drew a mouse on a train. Resilience is a choice. It's available to all of us. When you face setbacks, what choice will you make? To treat them as endings or as invitations to begin again? Again, here are the 5 lessons of early Walt Disney: imagination as compass, failure as tuition, ownership as leverage, innovation as multiplier, and resilience as a choice. Together, they shaped the boy who dreamed in black and white into a creator that gave the world its most famous mouse. And they remind us that greatness rarely arrives fully formed. It is built, tested, broken, and rebuilt. Walt Disney's story is proof that setbacks don't define us. The way we respond to them does. From a boy sketching in black and white, through failure and betrayal to the birth of Mickey Mouse, Walt Disney proved that imagination paired with resilience can change everything. Mickey wasn't just a character. He was proof that a spark of creativity, if nurtured, could light the world. But Walt was never content with one mouse. He dreamed bigger. Worlds bigger. And to build them, he had to take risks that no one believed could work. Next time, we'll step into the story of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, the gamble that nearly bankrupted the studio again, but redefined what art could be. If the story of Walt Disney inspired you, share this episode with a friend who might need it. And make sure you're following the Strategic Thinker so you don't miss the next chapter of this Path to Greatness trilogy. You can also join the waitlist for the Listening Room at maisonTST.com/listening room, where we'll share early access and deeper tools to help you on your own path. You hold the power to shape your destiny. Strategic thinking is your compass. We will build an amazing future, one thoughtful decision at a time. Until next time, keep getting better every day.